they've got curved swords. Curved swords! Hey mates, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Please excuse the hammy intro, but I couldn't resist. It gets mentioned so many times in the comments under videos about curved swords. So this is a relatively simple video, really just like a public announcement about curved swords. So I'm going to put this one down. So I've noticed over the years that people often talk about curved blades are better for this, curved blades are really good at that. Curved blades were developed because of this reason. Because of cavalry, or because of draw cuts, or all of these different reasons that people come up with. But one thing often goes overlooked, and that is the fact that there isn't only one kind of curved blade. So I think that most people are familiar with various types of curved blade from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, all over the place, from all of history. And very often these curved blades have a relatively uniform curvature. In fact, you can find swords with a fairly even curve throughout, so curving pretty much equally throughout, from all the main continents basically throughout history. That was European 1796. We could go to our big old recent favourite that I showed you, the Tegger, and you'll notice that basically it does curve all the way through. You could argue it curves slightly more in the second half of the blade, and this is an interesting thing, and this starts to touch on something. So essentially curvature can come, if we're just talking about backwards curvature for a minute, it can come in various different forms. Essentially you can get an even curvature throughout the blade, or you can get a blade which is more curved in the first half of the blade, or a blade which is more curved in the second half, in the tip half. And in fact, we have to say that overall most curved blades are averagely curved, not hugely curved, and they curve throughout the blade, like this Burmese dar, or like this 1796 light cavalry sabre. Or indeed, if I go to a katana. But there we start to get something interesting. Now this is actually probably a relatively old blade, it's not koto, but if you look at the top half of the blade here, you will notice that it's actually fairly straight. If we look along it this way, it's basically straight to there, and then it curves around this portion of the blade. So one of the characteristics of katana is they actually curve around here and then are relatively straight in the end of the blade up here. Whereas if we look at earlier blades, which were sometimes reused and remounted later as katana, but they would have originally been as tachi, so if we look at tachi, then you'll often notice there's a big curvature at the base here where the tang joins the blade, so nakago joins the blade. And if you notice, we do have some of that on this blade. So the hilt is going in this direction, and immediately the blade is kicking off there. And this is something which is quite peculiar. It's not unique, but it's peculiar and particular to Japanese blades. And it's more prevalent in early ones. So if we look in some of the earliest tachi surviving, they actually curve here and then are relatively straight for the rest of the blade. However, if we go later in period, that kink or bend essentially gets moved up the blade to about here. And in fact, of course, there are different types. If we look at naginata blades, then in fact the curvature is more towards the tip. So there's a lot of variety within Japanese blades, but you'll notice that the curvature, where the curvature really is, where it exists, is in different portions of the blade. And as I mentioned, this Tegger, although it is curved throughout the blade, it's actually relatively, if you look at the blade from there upwards, it's not really very curved at all. Really all of the curvature lives around here, around the third quarter of the blade, and you could say the whole second half of the blade as well. Now one of the most extreme and famous versions of this is the Ottoman sword, sometimes known as kilich, sometimes known as pala. And with this you will notice, if we chop the blade off there, and yes, this is a fairly recent acquisition, I'll be talking more about Turkish and Ottoman swords in the future, you will notice from there upwards is basically a straight blade. It's completely straight, and then it suddenly curves around here, very, very drastic, and then beyond that, if we just look at that, it's relatively straight again. So this is a straight blade and another straight blade joined by an articulation in the middle. And this is a very particular and peculiar type of blade, where really the curvature in the blade is restricted to a very, very small portion. It's also interesting to note, this is also a region of the blade where the cross section changes as well, from a T section to a more lozenge section as well. And the cuts are primarily delivered from there upwards. So while the cuts arrive at the target at a slanted angle, you still gain the reach advantage of the straighter blade. When you have a blade which is more curved throughout the blade, even though this is relatively straight, it does start to curve in the beginning of the blade, you're reducing your reach because the blade is already coming away from the target. And I should also mention, some blades, this is not a perfect example, but it was the best one I could get to hand, are actually relatively straight for most of the blade and then only curve right at the tip. You could say the Tega is like that. You could say that a Naginata tends to be like that as well. So, that's the news flash here. Just because a blade is curved doesn't mean that all curved blades are necessarily that similar. Some of them curve primarily at the beginning of the blade, some at the middle of the blade, some near the tip of the blade, and some curve equally throughout the blade. Now, question to you, get posting in the comments below, why? Why do you think in a country like India, for example, or indeed in Turkey, you find a variety of those different sorts? What do you it's not just that one culture does that and another culture does that. In India, you can find blades which are pretty much, well, some of them are imported Turkish blades, but they're essentially like a pala or kilic. And then you can find blades which are like a shamshir with a curve right the way through, and so on and so forth. So you can find a variety of curvatures in one place. And equally, if we look in Japan, the tachi has the bend near the hilt, and then later on with the katana, the bend is further up. Why is this? Why do you think this is? I mean, I've got theories and ideas. I've spoken about some of them in the past. I might look at this in a dedicated video if there's an appetite for it in the future. But I'd be very interested to read and see your theories. I think there's no published book where I've ever seen really a solid, convincing argument for why this should be. Final thing to finish off is, of course, there are also forwards curved blades, but we'll talk about those another time. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I hope I'll see you again soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.